for a bit, and then I'm going to answer questions. In fact, I'd like to, if possible, spend more time answering questions. I rarely get a chance to meet any of the regular viewers of my video. I occasionally, when I'm out and about, I see people, but mostly I'm here in my office in Illinois, or my studio, which is right across the hallway from where we are. In fact, I was just in there right before this, and I'll be back in there at the editing suite right after this. So I'm going to discuss the book just a little bit. Do start sending in questions, and I will get to those, and I will answer those. So I guess I should say I'm Bill Hammack. I'm the engineer guy. I assume most of you on here are familiar with the YouTube channel or watch the YouTube channel, but if not, Engineer Guy Video, and take a look. And in fact, if I turn my camera a little bit, there's a plaque from YouTube, which just arrived one day for when I got the million subscribers, right? So you have all ordered and maybe even got a copy of my book, The Things We Make, and I'm going to take you through that book a little bit. The reason that I wrote it is that it is really the principles, if you will, that underlie almost all the videos that I've made. And in those videos, I'm celebrating the creativity of engineers. That's what fascinates me the most, is the way that they solve things. And I really began to look into what is the engineering method? How do we describe it? And of course, it's a thing that, tacitly, at least, I've taught for years, and tacitly it's in the videos, but I wanted to formalize it a little more, and I wanted to make it apparent to everybody, what that engineering method was. So in this book, I start to introduce what the engineering method is. I start with cathedrals. And you may be like me, but whenever I've traveled, I enjoy going to cathedrals, looking at them, finding them stunning. And I got to reading about how they were constructed. And there's now a large literature from historians of technology and medieval historians of medieval technology, or Middle Ages, as they like to say, that talk about how these cathedrals were built and designed. And what fascinated me was, first of all, that they didn't use blueprints or drawings, that it was all in the head of somebody called the head mason. I mean, incredible 3D visualization they must have had. And that the masons rarely were literate, couldn't read, couldn't write, and for sure didn't have any knowledge of mathematics, not even the simple kind of second, third grade mathematics, geometry, and so on that we have. And as I looked into how they made the cathedrals, I realized that they were a paradigm or an exemplar for the engineering method. And I'm going to actually, this is a little bit old-fashioned, but I'm going to hold up a section of the book, but hopefully you all have that. I describe it here in detail, and I go over the video of how they designed the supporting walls for their arch, how they had a particular action that they took with a rope, and they made, I wouldn't use the word measurements because they had no numbers, but how they would use this rope in a particular way to get the proper thickness of the supporting wall. And once they got the thickness of that wall, then they built a stable cathedral. And they didn't actually know why this worked. They inherited it from the Romans. It had been around for centuries. It existed from experience. And it is what's called a rule of thumb, more formally called a heuristic, but we don't use that word too much in the video. And I think it's appropriate here to talk about a rule of thumb, because that's really at the heart of the engineering method. So a rule of thumb is something that helps you solve a problem and get to a solution more quickly, and doesn't necessarily guarantee success, but makes it likely. So the example that is on my mind is rules of thumb used for chess, and those are on my mind because at 3 o'clock today I go to chess club with my son, who's in a 2-3 class, second and third grade class, and we play chess for an hour. I'm not very good at chess, but I can tell you I play at least at the first grade level. I'm able to beat those. I struggle more with the second graders and the third graders. But a rule of thumb that you might have heard from chess is to control the center of the board. It's just a rule of thumb. And let's look at what that does. First of all, you won't win every game if you control the center of the board, but you will do much better than somebody who doesn't know that rule and violates that rule. So it doesn't guarantee success, but it does help you get to success. It does that partly by narrowing down the number of possibilities of the moves that you're going to make. Instead of all of the moves, you look at the ones that would control the center of the board. It is not absolute, and that it's relative, and that other rules of thumb may contradict it. Keep control of the diagonals, right? Don't move your king until late in the game. These are other rules of thumb that are useful and might contradict with that rule of thumb, but that's a characteristic of rules of thumb. It's not science. It's not something that has exactitude to it. And another characteristic of rules of thumb is that they are relative. They're context dependent. So in the case of chess, if you play speed chess, so you have a clock and you have only a certain number of minutes, you may find that the rules of thumb that were used for a regular chess game are no longer useful. And so in the case of cathedrals, they had this rule of thumb about how to design a wall, what size to make it. And there's a sense in which that rule of thumb was never proved false. I mean, we know it's not false because you can go to Europe and see cathedrals. I think in France, there's 500 of them alone. Very few cathedrals collapsed. Those that did collapse were after the Reformation, and so after a lot of neglect. But also most of the things that collapsed were towers and not cathedrals, and towers are a very different thing to build. What happened was the rule of thumb just became no longer useful because we have iron and steel. We use a post and lintel system to build things now. And so the rule of thumb is not, just not a useful thing. If you built a skyscraper using the rules of thumb from the Middle Ages, it would just collapse right away. We have different rules of thumb, if you will, that we use now. And it's interesting how universal this idea is. Every language has a phrase for rule of thumb, and they almost always are body parts. I think in Japanese, I think it's by the eye. I think in Russian by the nose. And I can't remember in French, but I list those in the book. But they almost always involve a body part. So that's the core of the engineering method, is to solve a problem using rules of thumb under some kind of constraint. So the best use of resources, and your goal is to solve a particular problem. And immediately we see a difference between science and engineering, because science is really about finding kind of truths in the real world, if you will, or the universe. And engineering is about solving real world problems in whatever way it is that we can solve them. So teleologically, there's a difference. So with that notion, I move in the book then to the idea of what we might mean by best. Because engineers have a relative notion of best, not an absolute notion. They're looking for the best subject to a certain set of constraints. And in that chapter, I talk a little bit about how the Egyptians separated the pulp from the grapes from the liquid, so a solid liquid separation if you're an engineer. And then I contrast that and compare it to how that was done in Amazonia. So we don't think about the Amazon, but around the time of Egypt, there was a huge group of people in the Amazon, in the black water areas there. And they had to separate solids and liquids, but in this case, their main food staple was manioc. And the problem with manioc is it's poisonous, which is a bizarre thing to have as your foodstuff. And they developed a way to separate that liquid poison. It was a long tube that operates kind of like one of those finger traps that you put your fingers in, and when you pull on it, it gets tighter. They used that to extract the juice from manioc. They could have heated the manioc, but that ruined the flavor of it. There were varieties of manioc that were less poisonous, but they felt that they were more likely to have pests and not grow as well and not be as tasty. And so they developed this method to separate the liquid. And so in there, I compare and contrast those. And the point that I'm making there really is how every solution to an engineering problem is relative. The Egyptians had a huge workforce. Those in Amazonia didn't. It was typically families that make it. In Egypt, they used cloth. And oops, my screen just disappeared. Let me get it back. In Amazonia, they were very good at weaving. And so they would weave these finger trap-like things in order to separate liquids and solids. But the main thing I talk about in there is color photography. And I talk about an early method for color photography, and I actually have an example here, and we're going to see how well it works. It highlights some of the problems. But this is a kind of color photograph from I'm purposely catching the light, from the 19th century. And if I tip it, you should see on the beak, or you should see some colors that are very vivid. You have to get right in front of it. We were filming this a little bit earlier. And this method, invented by a guy named Gabriel Lippmann, who won a Nobel Prize for it, although more famous today for being Marie Curie's thesis advisor, developed this method, and it was a way that you could reproduce the whites in a photograph or an image correctly, and that was something that was unique. But as I was holding that up there, you can see that it's not a particularly it's a not particularly friendly solution. You have to be in just the right spot in order to see it. And I don't know if I even got that spot, but if you have it in front of you, you can look for that and see it. And so I tell the story of how two musicians developed Kodachrome film and how they came up with layers of film that used additive color. So when you look through it, you see the different colors. And I talk about their chemistry, how they would sing in the laboratory in order to time the chemical reactions. And I talk about its triumph, but also point out that it didn't reproduce whites correctly. And so they had to adjust it. And that was their notion of best, but you had a film that didn't photograph everybody well. And I talk about the implications of that. So we had that notion of best. In the next chapter, I talk about uncertainty. And this is one of my favorite things about the engineering method, because engineers solve problems that have high degrees of uncertainty in them. The whole reason for the engineering method is to solve problems before we have full fundamental scientific understanding. We want our pharmaceuticals now, we want plastics, we want whatever the things are that we have, cell phones. We don't want to wait until they're fully and completely understood. And the prime story there I tell two stories, but one of them is Osborne Reynolds. And Osborne Reynolds was able to help engineers work their way around the most complex phenomenon in nature, and that is something called turbulent flow, or rather the transition from laminar to turbulent flow. So if you turn your faucet on, you'll find that the water moves very slowly. And if you turn it on very high, you'll find all these ripples in there, and it's gone from laminar to turbulent flow. And engineers want to know when that is going to occur, because they want to make use of those different flow regimes. If you're designing an airplane, you want laminar flow across the wing. If you have turbulent flow, you're in great trouble. But if you're mixing pharmaceuticals, you're making pharmaceuticals, you want to be sure that the flow is turbulent, so you get a lot of mixing. If you're cooling steel, like all the steel that's used in, the refrigerators and dishwashers and everything in your house, you want to cool that with a laminar flow of water. Turbulent flow induces defects and uneven cooling. So I talk about how he developed a way to what's called phenomenologically look at, understand when this transition is going to occur. And I make the point that he didn't understand it fundamentally. He didn't understand it at a molecular level, but he came up with a simple relationship among the diameter of a pipe, the viscosity of the liquids, the resistance to flow, and the speed that it's flowing. And engineers could use this to predict if they were going to have laminar or turbulent flow without fundamentally understanding the phenomena, which we still don't understand completely today. Still an area of research. The Clay Institute offers $1 million prize if you can solve some of the equations of motion to understand turbulence. And we see immediately that this is related to that rule of thumb that Masons had in the Middle Ages, in the sense that they didn't necessarily understand stone or the structural principles of stone. They didn't understand, stresses and strains in a mathematical way. But their rule of thumb let them build. Well, this equation developed by Osborne Reynolds let engineers parameterize flow by just measuring a few characteristics of it. Now, that was a 19th century achievement. And that kind of begs the question then that, well, okay, you're talking about old buildings and you're talking about 19th century things. Surely now in this scientific age, we don't need, to use these rules of thumb. We have exactitude. And again, that misunderstands why we have the engineering method. The engineering method exists to solve problems before we have scientific knowledge. So as science advances, the borderline where engineers work changes. So the line where certainty and uncertainty occurs moves out, and then an engineer goes to that borderline and does something. And I use an example that involves 21st century, late 20th century, 21st century science. I talk about Francis Arnold and how Francis Arnold created enzymes that will work industrially. So an enzyme is something that makes a reaction happen. Our body is filled with them. They do all sorts of stuff in our bodies, but they make chemical reactions or allow chemical reactions to happen. And some of the enzymes, the ones that, that she worked with, they broke bonds. Now, when you're an engineer, if you can break a bond, you're excited, because breaking bonds and then reforming bonds is how you make stuff. I'm a chemical engineer. It's how you make plastics. It's how you make pharmaceuticals. It's how you make chemicals, right? How you make paints. And so she wanted to tap into these enzymes in order to use them industrially. Now, what that meant was, first, she had to use them at high temperatures in an industrial environment. Enzymes at our body work pretty closely around 98.5 degrees, plus or minus only 2, 3, 4 degrees. I mean, you have a fever of 104, you're 105, you're in great trouble. And well, as your body approaches room temperature, you're even in more trouble, I would argue. And secondly, our body is mostly aqueous, so it's water. And so she needed them to work in solvents. So she wanted them to work in something like paint thinner. And she used 21st century science, late 20th century science, where we now understand the structure of an enzyme. We know all the amino acids that make it up. And so in principle, we can just change some of those amino acids, and all of a sudden it will work in paint thinner and it will work in different temperatures. But now here's the problem she had. The enzyme she was working with had 275 amino acids in it. There's 20 different types. So the number of configurations is 20 to the 275th which is about 200 trillion combinations. It's more than the number of stars. So the question is which do you change? And there was not and is not to this day a way from first principles to scientifically calculate, oh, change these and then it will work. So what she did, I think, is just absolute genius. And I will note she's a chemical engineer. Is she took that enzyme, she mutated it 10 different ways, stuck these 10 different mutations. So she only changed like 2 or 3 amino acids. She stuck them in paint thinner. Most of them just died, but one of them had a little bit of activity. And she took that one, mutated it 10 times, put it in more concentrated paint thinner, found out which of those did the best. A lot of them died, few of them worked, one worked really well. And she continued this maybe 3, 4, 5 times, up to 10 times. And in that way, she used what she called directed evolution. So she used nature's power to evolve an enzyme that will work in a harsh solvent at high temperatures. And now they're used to diagnose and treat disease. They're used to make chemicals and pharmaceuticals. And in fact, they're almost for sure in your laundry detergents because they break bonds. And so they break down stains. And when she accepted the Nobel Prize in 2018, the chemistry prize, she said, look, we still to this day don't understand how and why they work. And that's just classic engineering, right? Where you have great uncertainty, where you solve a problem. Science someday will catch up, no doubt, and you'll be able to calculate from first principles that this sequence of amino acids will do such and such a thing, and here's how you modify them. But of course, since the around 2000, so 25 years almost now, we've been using enzymes before science has figured it out. So when I talk like that, I think that really begs the question quite a bit about what is the relationship between engineering to science, because if you know how we educate engineers, we teach them an awful lot of science, right? And so we want to know what is the relationship between engineering and science. And I tell the story of the turbine. So let me pop up a picture here. But in the 19th century, trains and things were powered by steam engines. And if I show you a picture, you'll remember what a steam engine looks like. So there's a piston here that goes in and out as steam fills and evacuates from this chamber, and it drives a wheel. And that's a very inefficient way to use the power of steam. It comes from steam expanding. And so in the 19th century, a guy named Charles Parsons said, look, let us just put these bladed wheels on a shaft, blow steam down it, this will spin, and we can drive it directly, and we can use the steam better. Now, I'll get to his design a little bit, but I want to note that he invented this steam engine, that it did was much more efficient, much more powerful than a reciprocating engine. But he really wanted to use it in boats. He wanted the British Navy to use it, and no one would listen to him. So he built a small boat, put his engine in it, and then when the Navy gathered to celebrate Queen Victoria's, I think it was her Diamond Jubilee, so which one, I don't know, it was the 65th, I guess, or 60th. They were all, most of the Navy was gathered, their large ships and their speedboats, and he took his little boat and drove through this procession for Queen Victoria, and the Navy was not very happy, and they chased him, but they couldn't catch him. And then he looked at them and said, well, maybe you need my engine. And indeed, after that, they bought his engine, and it was used in the ships after the Titanic, the large White Star and Cunard ships eventually. But what he did was something that for 2,000 years people had tried to do, which is use steam to directly drive a shaft. And no one was able to do it because the steam would spin the shaft so quickly that the shaft would break, or the steam would go so quickly that it would just destroy the metal. And he figured out that he could make a series of blades and let the steam expand a little bit and slow everything down. So now we come back to science. He knew that in principle that's what he wanted to do, but how big do you make the blades? How many wheels do you put in there? What's the spacing between them? Because remember, the steam is expanding throughout. And what he did was he drew on work of scientists who had measured every property of steam, how much it would expand, how much energy it had at certain pressures. There was a French scientist named Renault that we have forgotten about today, but his name is engraved on the Eiffel Tower. And using that data, he could calculate that in principle, you could build a steam turbine, and he could calculate roughly the sizes that he needed to have in order to do it. Now, it took him 10 years to perfect that after he had that knowledge. Prior to that, no one could figure out, where to go or where to start. And so we see right away that a steam engine is a steam turbine, and the steam data, steam tables if you're an engineer today, were rules of thumb, that they allowed him to narrow the possibilities. They allowed him to know that something could happen. They guided him. And so science's relationship to engineering is the source of the very best grade A supremo rules of thumb. That's the relationship of science to engineering. And I think this story, particularly if I told it maybe a little more detail, highlights that you shouldn't call engineering applied science, because science didn't invent that turbine. To say that is to neglect the intuition of Charles Parsons, to neglect the 10 years of development. And it's a little bit like saying writing is applied lettering, right? Right. That you confuse the tool, I think, with the method. So from there, I move into a section where I talk about how the relationship between mathematics and engineering, and it has the same relationship as science does to engineering, and that it's rules of thumb. And what I talk about in that chapter is what's called the 100-year wind. So when you build a building, say the Willis Tower in Chicago, any large building, almost any building, you need to know what the typical winds are going to be. And you want to be sure that, it's unlikely to, be destroyed by wind. But you're an engineer. There's an economic aspect. You don't want to build it overly strong. That's really expensive, especially in a tall building. You want to build it just right. And so engineers developed the notion of the 100-year wind, and it's a statistical method to estimate what is going to be the maximum wind every 100 years, and they will build the building such that it can withstand the 100-year wind. They also have the 50-year wind, right? 25-year wind. It depends how tall your building is and its use, the use of the building. But the 100-year wind is for the skyscrapers. And I'm not going to go over the mathematics here, but I go over in detail mathematically how they do that. And at the end of the chapter, I point out that the mathematicians look at this mathematical method and say, wait, that's not good math. And the philosophers are like, wait, how can you do this? And it highlights that the way engineers use mathematics is as a rule of thumb, that they have a procedure, and the procedure works, and it has worked for years, and thus it is a reasonable thing to do. And I will note that it's based on using historical wind data. And as climate changes, they may well have to change that rule of thumb, but we're right back there to the rules of thumb of the Middle Ages, that you discard a rule of thumb when it's no longer useful. Then in the chapter after that, I take the paradigm invention, the thing that means invention, which is the light bulb. And I tell that story in a little different way. I mentioned Thomas Edison, of course, although I point out that the first commercial installation of light bulbs were not by Edison. They were by a person named Maxim. And I describe what Edison's contribution was and other people's contributions, and ask the question, should we really tell the story of invention as this one genius does this and then full stop, it's all over? And so I tell the stories of some of the people over the next 50 years that invented things that ensured that that light bulb became part of our world, right? Because it could have just been a toy. It could not have worked particularly well. And I talk about the improvements in those first 10 years that made it work well. And in the last chapter, I kind of bring it all together. And I talk about a favorite story of mine, which is the microwave oven. And I talk about how it came from radar. And in that chapter, I look at the central device used to make microwaves for radar called a magnetron, and look at how that evolved to work in our oven. What kind of changes did they have to make? How did they take all of these engineering things we're talking about, and how did they change the microwave oven magnetron? Now, I will mention to you that this book has a companion video series that is in 4 parts, covers much of what I've talked about here. It's illustrated. Each video is 12 minutes long. So there's 4 videos total, and it was to come out with the book, or preferably a little before, but because I have young kids, I got ill and lost my voice and wasn't able to record. So I was in today and edited the first video, and yesterday or the day before, I recorded the parts for the second video, and so I'm about to go back in there and edit when we are done here. And then I'll record the 3rd video tomorrow and the 4th video on Saturday, and then be editing next week and finalizing those. And so I hope shortly that those all come out. All right. Well, I thank you for joining and for buying a book. I'm going to look at the questions here. Send questions in. What event in your life sent you down the engineering rabbit hole? Okay, would like to, oh yeah, I'm going to answer these questions live here. Well, I discussed this in the afterword. I think it's the afterword to the book. My mother was a botanist, so she was a scientist, and my father was a theater professor. And maybe that explains why I make videos about engineering, right? One of the things that my parents loved to do, especially my father, was to take us on factory tours. So when we were on vacation, we would go on factory tours. And I can recall going to the Weyerhaeuser plant and watching wood being made. I can recall going to Kellogg's and watching cereal being made. I can recall the smell to this day. It was terrible. We went to a canning company and saw how they make the cans for vegetables, and we thought these were normal things to do on a vacation. And I think the spark was really set there. And in fact, my father loved to go to these. Years later, when I was a young professor, I would come home and we would go tour a nuclear plant that was being built, or we toured a plant where they make saran wrap. And that's where I learned that flies are a major problem, because you make saran wrap by blowing a big bubble and condensing it, and flies come along and run into it. So I think that's the event. And so in that afterwards, I also talk about going to engineering school, struggling a bit in it, and how it led to some of the things that are in this book. What's your view on the future of additive manufacturing in the engineering industry? Well, I'm not by any means an expert. I have played with 3D printing. And in fact, we made a video about the ink pen that you press the button on. And really, that was supposed to have a 5-foot pen that I would hold up. We thought that would look really good. And we were attempting to 3D print it and failed. And so we had all the drawings already, and so we just animated it, right? And I always like to have something to hold. It seems I just don't see I can see its use, and I know I was talking to somebody who works in the military and the kind of things that they're making for aircraft. It just still strikes me, and this is an uninformed opinion, is just fantastic for prototyping and for testing. But there's so many of these ways that you make things, like bending metal and things, that I would think are going to be hard to beat. So I would guess some use, but I'm not. My own thought is it's not going to be a panacea to replace it. Now, bear in mind, I like the most mundane things, and so I'm not necessarily on the cutting edge, but you asked, so I answered. Somebody says, hi, Bill, thanks for putting this on. I assume in the writing process there were plenty of inventions you wanted to write about, but were cut out or didn't make it in the end. Is there a favorite invention of yours that didn't make it in the book? I really wanted to talk more about silicon. I mean, there's maybe else, I have lots of ideas, but I think there's an argument that the most significant technological development in the world, in the history of the world, was controlling electrons so they can move in one direction only. So this is called diode action, right? And there was a section where I discussed the history of silicon, go back to conductivity and how they found electrons move, and then move all the way forward to where you hit diodes. And then, of course, with diodes, once you have one-way direction, you have a 0, no flow, or 1, and there's binary logic, and then you have a computer. It turned out just to be way, way, way too long to develop and include in the book. But that was there originally for a little while. Do you have a sense of how efficient, from a material standpoint, the thickness of stone, the rope heuristic is? Or another way, what is the factor of safety? I'm going to give you a precise answer. So they're asking the factor of safety. The reason that the Masons could build the stone that they did was because if you have a column of stone, the weight of the stone will begin to crush stones at the bottom when it's around 6,000 feet high, around 2,000 meters, okay? So let's use that 6,000. If you don't understand feet, just bear with me here. The tallest part of a cathedral in Europe is 404 feet. It's at Salisbury. So 404 feet versus 6,000 feet, they were way, way on the safe side of being able to build those. And that's one of the reasons that they were doing it. Someone asks, I work at UPenn and here you're coming here on the 19th. If I were to bring my microwave on my books, would you be willing to sign them? Of course I would. I will be giving the Quinn lecture on the 19th. If you go to engineerguy.com/events, you can find me there. I actually don't do very many events. I just don't travel that much. That is one that I'm doing. And yes, it's open to everybody, and I'd be glad to sign anything. I guess sign a microwave. I haven't done that, but maybe just bring your book. I don't know. But yes, I'd be glad to. Will there be any new engineering videos on your YouTube channel? Yes. So let's talk about that a little bit. And I wish I could actually talk to you and see you folks in person, but fine. 4 videos coming out, and then I have a number of videos in the queue, and I want to continue to make those. It's something I enjoy. The reasons that I haven't been making videos are just this strange multifactorial problems that I will tell you about. And if you've been on Reddit, you know them already. I mean, let us preface that I am just generally slow, just generally. And I have to think and think and think. And I'm also not that visual a person. But the pandemic came along, and we had lockdown, and my wife had to work throughout that, and worked around 14 hours a day. And so I was with the kids. I have 2 young children under 10, and so was simply with them all the time. So that stopped things. My workforce disappeared because I work with students, and they were not allowed at the university. And then when lockdown ended, they did an HVAC renovation of the building, which destroyed the acoustics in my studio, which took months and months to get fixed, but it did get fixed. So I'm back in there now. The studio works. I've got a set of students working with me, and I'm training them. So there's an induction period there. And so, yeah, I have more videos I want to do. This may or may not be relevant to you folks, but I want to play with TikTok a little bit and figure out what to do there. But the ones that I really like are these detailed videos that explain something and show something in film. So we have brand new 4K cameras, and it's something that I really enjoy doing a great deal. Is the book available outside the US or in other languages? All right. Well, I will ask the publisher about that. I believe it came out in Canada at the same time as here, and I think it's in Australia. I think it comes out in the UK in June and Germany in June, but I will try to get an answer to that and tweet something about it or post it. Some translation rights have been sold. I know Korean translation rights have been sold, but I don't know. So I will try to get better answers to that. I can confirm Canada. Somebody here says I can confirm Canada over here. So I have the chat open, and I have email, or sorry, my text number and WhatsApp open also, so in case you get a hold of me that way. All right, let me find the question and answers. What's an area you are woefully uneducated but eager to learn more about? This is not false modesty. I am ignorant in almost all of the areas that we talk about, and I have to spend time learning. I am a chemical engineer by training, so I did a little better with the diaper, a little better with those, but we don't have too many chemical ones. And so I spend a lot of time talking to people and learning them. Generally, I do struggle with mathematics. I wanted to do one on the Fourier transform for a while, and the mathematics make me struggle a little bit. What do you think about the divide between computer science and engineering? People think research in AI is computer science, but it seems most people apply rules of thumb, so it's engineering. Yeah, it's clearly engineering. In fact, for a long, long time, people would debate, and I'm going back here now, it's the 70s, right? Oh, can computers think? Computers not think about AI? Can they think? Can they not think? And I was always like, maybe not. That's a philosophical question. I mean, can I think? Can you think? What will happen is engineers will figure out a way to get computers to do things, and they'll do those things. And is it thinking? Is it not thinking? It doesn't matter. They've done whatever it is. I don't know. Drive a car. You know, Chat GP is writing things, right? Yeah, the computer science that I see, you know, a lot of it I would certainly call, you know, engineering. All right. Are there other questions?
Bill, in the chat, I'm seeing a couple questions from Mark.
Okay, let me look.
He wrote, what was the most difficult engineering problem or task that you took on?
That I took on? Yep, okay. Well, so most of mine is video production nowadays. I did have to redesign our unit operations lab when I was at Carnegie Mellon. I taught there for a decade, and I did miss by a factor of 10 on something, and we had a column that wouldn't function because of that. So decide to cut your losses. That most often happens on videos. We're always way too ambitious. I believe it was a 10-part video series for this, and kind of had to pare it down to 4 so that it could go out in time. We're always trying to film things and not able to film them exactly like we want, and so there's a number of videos that do just die after a while, right? Are there other questions in chat here? Let me look. Someone else loves factory tours. Okay. I still have time to answer more questions. If anybody has any questions, I would be glad to answer them about Anything? We get questions about the videos sometimes, and I was at a book event at Barbara's Books, and we had a lot of questions like that. And I'm going to take a cough drop too, so sorry about that. Am I thinking of writing another book? I'm always thinking of it. The next book that I write, I am interested in telling a little more of a narrative, so telling more of a story and a continuous story. But I haven't quite found the what that story is going to be. At the same time, I am in here reading. I mean, I don't sit here and read all day long, but this book, which is about the engineering Europe between the oceans, 900 BC to 1000 AD, and I'm interested in retelling world history, but from an engineering viewpoint in some way. Can we locate the important things and how they changed it, and can we look at history through a different lens? So I have notes on that. It's not fully developed, and that history of silicon that I talked about, although probably I'll get talked out of that. So the book, how long did it take to write? That's really hard to answer. And the reason is that I started it before pandemic. It stopped during the lockdown. You know, one would think you'd have lots of time. Of course, I have the kids, but I, you know, we're a lot of work, but you also just have this, you know, what's going on, this mental anxiety. And in fact, I thank the groundskeepers at a local park here in the acknowledgments, if you read them, because the kids could run and I could watch them from a distance and think about the book, but I couldn't write. And then I finished it afterwards. So I'm guessing it's around 18 months total to do. What's your method when you're trying to solve a problem, but the answer feels either unattainable or too difficult to achieve? How do you know when it's time to quit? Oh, that's just such a good question. Because there's certainly things that we quit on. I sometimes use the heuristic of a deadline. You know, like when we was developing the videos series to support this book, you know, if we don't have 6 or 7 of them outlined by X, then it's got to decrease. And so, you know, I just use the time frame to do that. Your favorite problem to solve? This is no surprise. I love how to explain something via video. The thing that excites me is where do I find entry points so people can understand it? And then how do I tell that story? And we have a machine shop here that's available to me that cuts things open to us. And I just love that, figuring out how to tell it and organizing that information. And I gave a lecture to a class here on Monday on how I write scripts and how I do that. I don't know if it really, you know, juniors here, I don't know that it really resonated with them, but I talked about how I think about the scripts. Have you ever read the book Ignition? I have not read the book Ignition, but I'm going to note that one. So, longitude. I assume someone asked, have you considered doing a video on the Longitude Prize? And it is the Longitude Prize. I wish we had a little more. Send me something in chat. Is the Longitude Prize the one? Is that the story of the guy who invented the watch, right? Interesting that you should ask that. Let me get back to that, because yes, that's one that almost made it in the book and didn't. And so what the reader is, with listener, viewer, whatever, attendee is talking about is, in the 18th century, John Harrison invented a watch, and the watch was used to measure time so they could measure longitude. And that almost made it in the book, but not in the way that you expect, because I love that book. It's a book that started me on thinking about talking to the public. I read it when it came out. I think it was the early 90s. But the story is told wrong in a sense, and that she makes a villain out of a guy named Masculine in it. And the part that she doesn't tell is that the way that Masculine developed these tables to do it was what was used for the next 30, 40, 50 years successfully, right? And so I wanted to tell the other part of that story and tell it in what I thought was historiographically a more correct way. So while I like the watch story, there's a way in which it isn't complete because the watch was not used for a long, long time. The other method of the villain in that story was used. And there's a wonderful paper in the Annals of Computing that tells this story more completely. Why did you choose chemical engineering over other engineering disciplines? You know, I like math. I liked chemistry. They had high starting salaries. My brother was a botanist or a biologist and told me that they did. And so I started there and enjoyed the chemistry part. And so stuck with it. I think chemical engineering is also less visual. The mechanical engineers I know have a very visual mind. The electrical engineers I know have a very mathematical mind, and I don't have those. And I was able to think about the chemistry. The Artemis missions on the moon, apart from gravity, with unique challenges to solving engineering problems on another world. I don't know. I will tell you right now, I'm reading Carrying the Fire by Michael Collins about Apollo 11, and I'm reading that again. And I recommend that to anybody. It's by my bedside right now. And there's a wonderful documentary called Apollo 11, which uses actual footage that I recommend. Related to this, I've thought about a series that talks about the engineering of how we got to the moon, because that is truly stunning. And there's a wonderful book by David Wood, I think, or David Woods, called How We Got to the Moon, that goes over every step of the engineering, and so is a great source for that. In terms of engineering, what do you think is a new technology or rule of thumb that's likely to have a significant impact over the coming years? I don't know. I'm terrible at that kind of thing. I'm the kind of guy that when the iPhone came along, I said, who would want one of those? And of course, it turned out to be me. And I, love my smartphone. So I'm also a guy who talks about, retractable pens and, plastic injection molding and pop cans. And so it's the quotidian a little more. What do you think about the AI tools that are popping up? I have not fully investigated those. I've been meaning to play with Chat GPT, and haven't had time. And so I will tell you this, though. I've been looking into machine learning, which I assume is what you mean by AI, and was actually talking to somebody from Moderna who feels that that's how they're going to do development. And what I can learn about machine learning is it is just simply the engineering method on steroids. It is exactly what I have talked about in that book, and that it's kind of empiricism on steroids to find connections. Somebody asked about modern rocket development compared to the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo methods, and I'm just not knowledgeable enough to answer that. Don't know. The Leaning Tower of Pisa. I saw a documentary on it. What would you say that the Leaning Tower of Pisa is an engineering marvel by accident, and how modern day engineering was able to rectify the well, I think it was by accident. I don't think they meant it to lean. So I'm just not that familiar. I almost got to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but the train didn't arrive, and so we couldn't go out there and see it. So yes. All right, other questions? My favorite video is how a retractable pen works. Do you have any videos like that in mind? We always have videos like that in mind. You can always send me ideas too and things to look for. All right, how are we doing here?
All right. We have just a few more minutes left. If anyone has any final questions, we can give people a few seconds to type those out.
I'm happy to.
Yeah.
I'm done here. I'm going to go back to editing the second video, and I'm going to go to chess club after that. What do your kids think about your fascinations? Do you try to get them interested in engineering and science? Well, they like to build things. They like to come to my studio and build things. They request to come to the studio because the studio is filled with all sorts of interesting stuff and tools and things to play with. Dad here, though, does not really want them touching the 4K camera and other kinds of things. And so there's a little bit of tension. So they do come, and they do come and see it. They're a little young now. They kind of like everything. We read some of those books, but there's a thermodynamics book for kids that we read, but they like everything. The younger one does like to build stuff. You mentioned silicon. Is there one particular topic you want to cover in a video? Is there, you mean of silicon? So you can add a thing to that. And somebody would like videos on fountain pens, fillers, methods over the years, and I think that could be interesting. So I'm not quite sure the silicon one, what to answer there. All right, somebody very nicely says, thank you for taking time to chat with us today, and I'm happy to do that. Are there any emerging technologies or innovations you are excited about? You know, I'm getting old. It's the medical ones, right? That's the ones that I'm excited about, right? So I'm not, usually I'm looking at old things and asking, the thing that I like are things that have, you know, lasted forever, or, you know, been around for a long time, that are stable solutions. And then why is that a stable solution? You know, why is the pop can? Why is plastic injection molding, and so on? You know, why are those things that succeeded in the way that they did? All right. Someone says, thank you so much. That was lovely. That's very nice of you to say, because from my viewpoint, I can't see you folks. So someone from Greece. Well, that's a place on my list to make. Are there other technology and engineering channels you watch on YouTube? Smarter Every Day, I do watch. In fact, Dustin called me once, said, I'm calling the smaller YouTubers. I regularly just search for things on there. Yes, I've heard of Mark Roper. I usually am searching for something specific, and I look for that. People always want to cross over. They always want to cross over with another YouTuber.
All right. Thank you so much, Bill. This was awesome. Everyone. Oh, we had one last question. Do you want to?
What is that?
It's in the chat.
For father kids engaged in engineering, let them build stuff. I'm thinking, you know, that's the only thing I can think is let them build stuff. I regularly let my young son do all sorts of experiments in the kitchen that I don't really want to clean up after, but you know what? Let's just let him go, and then I will clean up. All right.
Awesome.
Madeline, thank you so much. Thank you for your help.
Oh, thank you, Bill. That was great. Such great advice. I loved listening to your talk and read such interesting questions. So thanks, Bill.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.